Welcome everyone to our webinar. Here's Sherry Hubert.
Good evening. Thank you so much. As Mary had mentioned, my name is Sherry Hubert and I have the privilege of serving on the board of directors of the Harvard Business School African American Alumni Association. And thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar, Moving from Persecution to Prosperity, Demystifying Black Excellence. I have the privilege of introducing the host of this evening's webinar, Ian Rowe. Ian is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education and upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. He's also the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools opening in the Bronx in 2022. He has been widely published in popular press, from the New York Post to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Examiner. Ian is also the author of a forthcoming book tentatively entitled Agency, which seeks to inspire young people of all races to build strong families and to become masters of their own destiny. Ian holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School and a BS in Computer Science Engineering from Cornell University. With that, welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the Harvard Business School African American Alumni Association for hosting this event. I'm hopeful that this will be the first in a series of Black-led conversations about what is the best path forward for us as a Black community to achieve increased prosperity. So thank you to Beverly Anderson, to Sarah Clark, to Brittany Williams, and Mary Broussard-Harmon. I'm really excited to be joined by two incredible gentlemen. One is Glenn Lowry and the other is Thomas Chatterton Williams. Glenn Lowry, at the age of 33, became the first African-American tenured professor of economics at Harvard University. He's currently the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. Glenn, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks, Ian. Good to be here.
Yeah, and Thomas Chatterton Williams joins us from Paris. He is an incredible cultural critic and author. His book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, is a must-read. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. He was a 2019 New America Fellow and a Berlin Prize recipient. Thomas, thank you, and thank you for everything that you've done. And
thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so I'm very excited to have this conversation. Part of why we came up with this idea is that there's a lot of discussion. I mean, we as a country are going through a national reckoning on race, and there's a lot of discussion about what should be the path forward. And sometimes what's frustrating is that there are a lot of folks outside of the community pontificating about what is best for us. And so I thought would be very powerful to launch a series where we talk about real issues that face our community and have that discussion be led by Black people in front of a predominantly Black audience. So thank you guys for joining, and thank you for everyone in the audience. What we envision is that Glenn, Thomas, and I will be in discussion for about 45 minutes. You can start posting questions right away in the Q&A section, because for the last 45 minutes or so, we'll hopefully be engaged in a very rich dialogue answering your questions. So please, this will work best if you're engaged and asking lots of questions. And so let me just set up, frame out this discussion. As we think about how should we think about how we move from persecution to increased prosperity? Because as I said, there's a lot of sort of dominant ideology of what that pathway should be. So for example, in President Biden's first week as president, he announced that he is putting equity at the center of his agenda with what he called a whole of government approach to embed racial justice across all federal agencies, all federal policies, all programs. And he said he is committed to take bold action to advance a comprehensive equity agenda. And that's and this is the real world. This is my son, Oscar.
Ah!
Hi. All right. I'll see you later.
Well, no, we're ordering from our shows. What do
Pasta. Just give me some pasta. All right. This is the world of the world we are currently living in. In some ways, everything that we're talking about is for his future. So that's my son, Oscar. And as someone who has run public charter schools for the last decade in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and I'm now launching a new network, I'm particularly interested in education outcomes for kids. And President Biden said he is taking bold action to advance a comprehensive equity agenda to end disparities in education. What I find interesting about it, when I was at HBS, you didn't need a federal mandate for equity. Everyone wanted equity because equity meant ownership in an enterprise with unlimited potential. But now equity seems to mean something very different. It seems to mean equality of outcomes by race. Should that be the framework for Black prosperity? When I ran schools, I wasn't running schools so that I could close racial achievement gaps so that Black kids could equal what white kids were accomplishing. I mean, what's interesting is that there's something called the Nation's Report Card that every 2 years since 1992, there's a test throughout the country to test how our kids are doing in reading and math. And one thing that's very interesting that people don't seem to know is that in every single administration of that test since 1992, less than half of white students in the 4th, 8th, and 12th grades scored proficient in reading. Never beyond 50%. In fact, I think the highest number is about 44, 45%. So closing the Black-white achievement gap in terms of academic outcomes would actually mean that Black students are moving from sub-mediocrity in terms of academic outcomes to full mediocrity. Why would we set up a racial equity agenda when the white standard of outcome is not an exceptional one? And so this idea of racial equity, it seems to either mean Blacks must equal whites, or maybe Black achievement must equal our percent representation in the population. But in either scenario, both seem to be, in my view, insulting limitations as opposed to focused on Black excellence. So given this dominant focus and that there certainly seems to be this ideology of equity, not only from President Biden and the federal government, but almost through every major sector of society, that seems to be a dominant ideology and a framework that is being imposed on the Black community in order for us to achieve prosperity. But the beautiful thing about the Black community is that we all don't think the same. We're not monolithic. We're all capable of individual thought. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Glenn and Tom to get their thoughts on this as well. So Thomas, let me start with you. What am I missing? I presume you've heard about a racial equity agenda. What am I missing in terms of how I'm formulating it?
Well, thanks, Ian. I'm not sure you're missing so much. I think you raised really excellent points. Equity with whom is such an important question to be asking. Whites don't have equal outcomes with Asians, for example. I think we should be asking how to maximize excellence and lift people out of intergenerational poverty, irrespective of superficial identity markers. And we should be asking also the more difficult questions about why it's easier to do things like pay Robin DiAngelo $50,000 to speak for an hour about why whites are so privileged and fragile. Why is that easier than it is to make it possible for even a handful more students from genuinely lower class backgrounds of any so-called racial group to gain access to places like Harvard? Moreover, I've really begun to think that racial equity has become a way to reify categories that are already weakening before our eyes in the real world, in the real complicated lives that many of us are already living. I fear we're in danger of fighting yesterday's racism in a world in which Harvard has 23 times as many rich students as poor students, regardless of color. I mean, according to recent lawsuits, Harvard's 2019 class is 40% white, 24% Asian, 14% African American, and 14% Hispanic. But some 82% of those students are economically advantaged. Under some proposed models for admissions that would eliminate racial and legacy preferences, but boost poor applicants' chances, the average result would be fewer white and Black students, but more Asian American and Hispanic students. But that's a conversation about equality of opportunity and outcome that few sincerely want to have. And finally, I just observed that, frankly, the real world, real life is culturally biased. By that, I simply mean that not all values, traditions, and patterns of behavior lead to the exact same outcomes. So we can simply compare Asian Americans with whites and see that this is obviously true. As such, I don't see how equity among groups can be fairly imposed from the top down. I think it really has to be built organically from the ground up.
Very helpful. Glenn, what do you think, this idea of equity, can you impose from on high?
I think it's the latest iteration of an old story. I think that we're at a moment here, 2021, we're 50 years past the closure on the civil rights movement. That's a long time. That's as long as from the end of the Civil War to the end of World War I. And we still have, we still have a disparity problem, and it manifests itself in many dimensions, from the issue of police killings to achievement gap in higher education and in various underrepresentations and so forth and so on. And the language is being adapted to the popular sentiment. You talk about structural racism, systemic racism. It's a move from understanding equality in terms of opportunity and the treatment of people to understanding equality in terms of patterned outcomes that are meant to represent forces that are structurally arrayed against African Americans and so on. So I think it's inevitable. I think the political momentum here is, in the direction that it's going in. I mean, Biden owes his, escape from ignominious defeat in South Carolina to the Black vote. We know that the Black vote was critical in various states. We have a professional political advocacy class that are going to be appointed to, Assistant Secretary of Education for civil rights, or et cetera. And we're going to see more, and we're going to see more, and we're going to see more of this. So I don't want to take up too much time. I have a concern. So there's equality and there's equality. There's equality of representation, where you count heads and you say we've got enough Blacks. And then there's real equality, equality of achievement, equality of mastery, equality of respect, command. And we seem to be willing to settle for the former. We seem to be willing to buy into symbolic equality, a titular equality.
Who's we?
Well, we is the prominent zeitgeist, not only among African Americans, but amongst so-called progressive sentiments that has given rise to the edict from the Biden administration that you started off with in the first place. The people who write editorials for the major newspapers, who give grants at the foundations and prizes from the Pulitzer Committee and all of that. The people who decide what's in the Tony magazines as they talk about racial equity. Let me be concrete here and explicit. Affirmative action in 1980 is one thing. Affirmative action in 2000 is a different thing. Affirmative action in 2020, affirmative action in 2050. Are we going to be perpetually dependent upon a separate deal, a different standard, a dispensation in virtue of the mistreatment of our ancestors? That's not equality. I don't care how many people end up on the board of the company or how many people end up on the faculty of the university. The fact that we would build into the cake a dependence upon a special dispensation is not equality. So that's what I mean when I say what kind of equality. Now, I think there's only one path to that kind of equality: developing the capacities of our people to perform. The issue here is not bias against us because of the color of our skin. That exists. It will always exist. The issue here is grasping the nettle, the historical imperative, to confront the underdevelopment of our people where it manifests itself and to redress that underdevelopment. Now, if you've got jails overflowing with young Black men, and if you've got kids who are 17 years old reading at a 13-year-old grade level, that's not developing the capacities of your people to perform. History will not be changed. It is what it is. But we can change the future by developing our capacities to perform. Nobody can do that for us.
Wow. Well, that is why I run schools. So, Thomas, let me just ask you though, because what Glenn just laid out is a model of self-determination that's very powerful, and yet the racial equity agenda, and please, folks, please add your questions. It's intoxicating. There's something that it has moved with such velocity, not only in education, but almost every institution. What is it that's so compelling? It's like a gravitational pull. Why do you think it's happening?
Why has the ethos of anti-racism caught fire in the past couple of years, but really in 2020?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the question that I've been trying to figure out myself. I mean, just today I was walking down the street in Paris and I ran into a girl that I knew in Brooklyn 17 years ago, 15 years ago. And she's a French Vietnamese girl. I've never heard this woman mention race or racism before. I've never even heard her refer to herself as anything other than French. And she said, oh, it's been so long, like I've started getting into mindfulness, and I'm in an anti-racist mindfulness practice. And it's a practice where white people are really open and honest about their racism. And I realized that us as POC, I couldn't believe, I mean, this is a foreigner. There was a mass psychological snap that happened after the death of George Floyd that I think we're going to be unpacking for a long time. And we're going to have to be thinking through why so many white people, many of them well-meaning, have decided that the psychological ramifications of their guilt are such that standards are out the door. I mean, the stuff that Glenn was just saying about how there's equality and then there's equality, that really resonates with me because I can't get past the patronizing aspect of it all. I don't want the kind of equality that seems to be on offer right now. I'd rather actually live with a kind of inequality and earn it the harder way than to be given some things the way that they're on offer now. And so I would just say a point that I really want to make, and I won't talk too long, is that any anti-racism that doesn't hold as its ultimate goal the abolition of racial categories, full stop, in my view, that's never going to be able to solve the real problems that we're dealing with. We'll be fighting endless zero-sum battle royales that pit identity groups against each other ad infinitum. Society won't transcend the racism that always most profoundly harms poor Blacks, so long as we continue to reify race. As Barbara and Karen Fields, two brilliant Black historians and sociologist sisters, wrote in Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, racism creates race and not the other way around. So my view is that these identity categories are therefore irredeemable, and the best path forward for the Black community would also be the best path forward for American society as a whole. And that would be to seriously de-emphasize the politics of identity. With that said, I think I differ with Glenn. I do differ with Glenn here. I think that in order to de-emphasize the politics of identity, I think a serious component of that would necessarily be some form of serious reparation to the Black community that descends from American slavery and Jim Crow, because it's not just slavery. Beyond that, I think we need affordable healthcare, we need quality daycare, quality public education, and we need those things for everyone, irrespective of skin.
Yeah, I'm glad. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I do actually. First of all, I want to just underscore how fundamental and radical is what Thomas Chatterton Williams just said. He said, in effect, let's call the whole thing off. You want to get out of the race domination business? Let's call the whole thing off. And that's easy. I can see people giving it the back of their hand and dismissing it without appreciating the radical character of that intervention, because it is, after all, something that we have agreed to do. The raciality is something that we are agreeing to acknowledge, reproduce, reinforce, reaffirm, reify. It's something that we're doing. We're performing race. It's not really a thing given in nature. It's a thing constructed in social interaction. And that actually goes to the very point of the enterprise that you, Ian, have launched here, where you've gathered Black-led discussions of Black, we constitute ourselves for the purpose of acting in a communal way as Black people. Are we going to give that up too when we enter into Thomas's nirvana? I say with great respect to Thomas, but I say it's a conundrum. I'm saying the race thing is a tar baby, man. You got it, okay? It ain't gonna be easy to get out. I just think we need to take the measure of that. Everything is going in the wrong direction. Suppose I were to say, and I won't go on long, Ian, let's stop drawing congressional districts so as to accommodate the desire to ensure that there's an adequate number of African American representatives. People would say, I'm against the Voting Rights Act. They would say, I'm against equality. The president of the United States just declared that his entire administration was going to be organized around a certain principle. We're way down the slippery slope on that.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about what you both are saying, we don't want to have race continue to be the focus if we ultimately want race not to be the focus. But what's also interesting to me is every time there is a discussion about race, particularly about Black people, there is an immediate focus on the pathologies, the level of criminal activity, the level of police abuse, all of these things. And it's as if there isn't a successful Black community at all. I mean, here we are, the first African-American tenured professor, a best-selling author, speaking to the alumni, the Black alumni of Harvard Business School. There's tremendous success. Why isn't our framework for how we achieve increased prosperity a deep understanding of what has empowered those members of the Black community to be successful? There was a study a few years ago called Black Men Making It in America. And many people haven't heard about it, but the study measured a significant number of Black men who've moved to the middle and upper class and tried to understand, is there anything common? Are they all just LeBron James? Are they all just anecdotal athletes? Or is there anything common that can be replicated? And surprise, surprise, there were some pretty basic things. Those men who completed their education, got a full-time job of any kind, just so they learned the dignity and discipline of work. And if they had children, marriage first. That progression of series of life decisions, more than 90% of the people who've taken those decisions have avoided poverty, and the vast majority entered the middle class or beyond. Why aren't we obsessed with the success and this idea of demystifying Black excellence? How do you guys respond to that?
Well, I'm willing to say I think it's politics. I think the reason that you don't point to success amongst African Americans is that it undermines the claim that the bias in the system is such that African Americans cannot succeed. It affirms something that I think people are very reluctant to affirm, which is that the outcomes that befall African Americans depend on what we do. If you were to highlight success, you could not avoid observing, as you just did in summary about the marriage sequence. But the point is, of course, much more general. How hard does a person work? How much risk does the person take? How much responsibility does the person assume, et cetera? you then end up in a world where people are being held, Black people, responsible for the outcomes that befall them in life. So to emphasize success is by inference, by indirect but necessary coincidence, to point to failure and the reasons for the difference between success and failure for which individuals are responsible. That's a political, philosophical message that a lot of progressive racial equity advocates don't want to affirm.
I mean, Thomas, when some people hear what Glenn just said, they say, "Oh, you're saying I just have to pull myself up by the bootstraps, right? That you're either blaming the victim or you're somehow, yeah, you're somehow blaming me for the plight that we have created." How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Yeah, I mean, you're writing a book with the title Agency in it. I mean, that's a subject that has basically been at the center of my work also since I came out of grad school and started writing. I mean, I'm trying to figure out for the past 10 years why there's been such resistance, and it's not uniformly in the Black community at all. There's a lot of there's quite a receptive audience in the Black community, in my experience, for narratives about agency and for for speeches extolling bootstrapping. Actually, there's quite a lot of resistance that I've personally encountered from outside the Black community towards arguments about agency, and I don't have the answers for why exactly that is. But the fact of the matter is that I'm not sure that bootstrapping is a bad idea. I mean, I grew up in a household where I was always told that I was going to have to work twice as hard. I never really thought that much about it. It's just what my dad told me my brother and I had to do. And, when I worked really hard, I got good results, and those kind of reinforced behaviors that were effective. And it wasn't something that we sat around and discussed why that was so unfair. I'm not personally so averse to the idea that some groups have been oppressed more recently than others. All groups at some point in time have been oppressed. And what do groups do to transcend their oppression? And what are some of the behaviors that even oppressed people can do to contribute to their own oppression? I'm interested in
maybe first start with not thinking that you're oppressed.
Well, or not thinking that you're going to be defined by your oppression or permanently stuck in a state of oppression. I think that's really, it starts on a level of belief. And the solutions that you've suggested, those are obviously effective, but they're, in terms of narrative power, they don't excite the imagination the way that Manichaean stories of kind of omnipotent evil do, the way that some best-selling books have capitalized on that kind of dynamic. So
a white supremacist story is more compelling than
the book that says, graduate, get married before you have babies, teach your kids phonics. These types of books, they're never going to do numbers like Between the World and Me, which says that whiteness will always be at the top and we will always be the faces at the bottom of the well until climate change corrects this original sin.
Wow. So folks in the audience, we need some authors out there to write some riveting books about the things that you've done in your own lives. Yes, Glenn, go ahead.
Excuse me for interrupting you, Ian. No, I just wanted to add that nobody is coming to save us. I mean, life is not fair. I'm sorry to sound preachy here. There's no being in the sky moving things around to make sure everything works out fairly. The hand you're dealt is the hand you're dealt. It's not fair. That's not the point. The existential point is that we really have no alternative but to take responsibility for our lives because nobody is coming to save us. I mean, and the nature of this advocacy that appeals to the system, to white power, to redress racial exclusion, which is supposed to be rooted in white supremacy and white racism, that's a non sequitur. What you make the moral agent the white racist. You make that person the agent of deciding what happens. By your whole politics is a politics of appealing. You throw yourself on the mercy of a court which you believe to be fundamentally biased. There's no choice but to take responsibility. Bootstrapping is not a policy recommendation. It's an existential imperative.
Wow. So Glenn, you've framed, so let's say racial equity, and again, I want to have questions come from the audience. If racial equity is not the frame, you started to intimate that you were talking about this, the difference between a development narrative and a bias narrative. Just talk a little bit more about those two poles that you have, that you've set up.
Okay, so after the emancipation, 1863, 1870, 1880, 1890, the newly freed slaves who were not equal citizens under the law, but who nevertheless faced the challenge of acquiring the ability to read, acquiring skills, acquiring land, developing their families, confronting the realities of their freedom. By analogy, the ending of the civil rights movement and the dawning of an era of a concern for racial equity and inclusion confronted we African Americans in the middle, late part of the 20th century with a comparable kind of imperative. And I'm saying when you look at the numbers and you see the disparities that we could tick off, we're seeing a half century later, the still unfinished business of completing that process. And I've said no one can do it for us. And, I mean that, but the seductive temptation is because the history is so unfair, so blatantly unjust, to root our politics in that rather than rooting our politics in development. And I want to emphasize, development does not mean every man for himself. It does not mean no healthcare. It does not mean no government. I'm not going laissez-faire here. I'm not saying forget about it and wash our hands of it. And while I have the floor, let me just say to Ian, the reason I don't want to do reparations is precisely that. I do not want to commodify the moral obligation that the country bears to African Americans in virtue of our history. I don't want to make a bargaining chit out of that. I don't want to have a transaction. I want to take our moral capital and lend it to the project of making this a decent society for everybody through a kind of progressive politics that would construct a social contract that's fair and decent. If we did that, if we Black Americans gave to America instead of asking what America could give to us, the moral impetus out of having to address our education needs, our housing needs, and everything else, we put that on the table along with other like-minded Americans. We can create a different society here, not get paid. Getting paid is a snare and a delusion. The underlying developmental issues will not be remedied by that transaction. We'll find ourselves 50 years down the line with a similar challenge, and we will no longer have the capacity to compel the nation's attention to our people's needs.
We will no longer have that moral authority. Well, so Thomas, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you think, one of the things we need to do is stop reifying race, except in this one category of racial reparations. How do you think about the risks that Glenn just articulated if we were to do this? Because it's sort of, once the reparations are paid, you can't come back for more. Like, how do you think about what the risks would be?
Yeah, well, a couple of things for that. First, I want to say, I don't think that reparations is actually a racial reification. I think that in fact, it would be the opposite. A specific group of people went through a specific experience in a specific time and geographical space. And some of them are still walking around today who were disadvantaged by redlining practices in the Jim Crow South and even in the North. And after that, there are people walking around today who were harmed by government policies who were denied access to government lending. Lots of things that Sandy Darity at Duke and other people are studying and talking about quite seriously. That has nothing to do with blood and skin. That has to do with coming from a specific community of people in this country at a certain time. It doesn't have to do with ambient blackness that would link it to anybody who immigrates to America at any time and happens to share a specific amount of melanin or what have you. So it's not racial, actually. It's addressing something that happened to a community. That's what I think. I do take seriously Glenn's point that a significant number of people would not necessarily be made suddenly equal by whatever the sum of money would be that would come at them. And then the moral capital would be spent. But I think, and I'm not an expert here, I think that there are people that are studying exactly how to address some of those concerns. And I think that it would be really worthwhile to hear out what some of the proposals could be and what some of the safeguards could be put in place to make sure that it's not just something that in 20 years, 30, 40 years looks like a squandered opportunity. But I do also take seriously Glenn's frequent debating partner, John McWhorter's concern that there would be a kind of, no matter how big the reparation payment would be, that there would be a kind of permanent argument that no sum could ever be big enough. And so it would actually kind of just be like pouring gasoline on the fire of this permanent original sin that we can never get through. So I don't know. I mean, we are in a bind and we're quite far down the slippery slope, as Glenn said. But in my own life, my experiences have always shown me that when people can actually interact as equals, and that has a lot to do with some material concerns, then a lot of this other stuff can start to take care of itself too. And so I think we have to try to find ways to lift up the poor who are disproportionately Black. And so in that way, I think I agree with a lot of what Glenn was saying about Black people have a role to play in making America a much better society for everybody. And that will help Black people. And that's not necessarily fair, but we can all flourish together this way.
So let me ask you a question, both of you. I've had no shortage of conversations over the last, well, for much of my life, but certainly in the last year. My family is from Jamaica, West Indies, a number of colleagues from West Africa, Nigeria, and other places who've come to the United States and thrived. And there's kind of they don't even get not all, but some don't even get the quest for reparations. When in their eyes, they see massive opportunity. How do we balance these differing views within our own racial community, especially as it relates to something like reparations?
Can I quickly just answer that and then pass it to Glenn? I would say that, we have to be careful about comparing people who move somewhere with the motivation to leave their society, to start a new life somewhere else, with people that were, descended from a community that was brought here involuntarily. I just think that those are two different things, but it does make interesting points about the extent to which skin bias is an impediment to succeeding in this society.
Well, isn't that the fundamental?
Yeah, but I do think that there are also different kinds of motivations that immigrants can bring with them. So I think it's interesting insofar as it talks about one aspect of the problem, but it doesn't explain the whole thing.
But you act as if people are not responsible for their motivation. I mean, what the success of the immigrants shows is that success is possible. Of course, there can be accounts given for why people don't take advantage of that possibility of success. The structure can't be responsible for every aspect of the being of the people. Otherwise, you trivialize the people. They have no independent character or existence, except for what history has determined them to be. So I take the point as a social scientist that you have to allow for selectivity when you make comparisons. I think that's an absolutely correct point. But I think the more profound point is that the human experience of different communities, the variation in it, shows what's possible. And it leaves us with the question of why it is that some communities are not taking advantage of that possibility. But I want to just remind us that here we are. I mean, we're 150 years past the end of slavery and we're still talking about slavery. That ought to tell you that something is not quite right here. And I want to say that it's not just about Black people. This is about the country that we're talking about. So when the Japanese who had been interred by the Roosevelt administration in the Second World War got their reparation, it was 80,000 people who, as Thomas suggests, were individual persons who had been interred and harmed, dispossessed, and had a claim. And they got 20,000 ahead, 80,000 people, $1.6 billion. Now we've got 40 million African Americans. I don't care how you pare that down, you're still left with tens of millions of people. And if you put any kind of number on that, you're well into the trillions of dollars. You've got a Social Security magnitude social intervention formulated. You say it's not racial, it's circumstantial. Come on. The whole history of the advocacy of this thing is a part of the racial equity vision and narrative here. It is, in effect, racial. And you're creating social policy based upon racial narrative. This is not the country that we want to leave to our grandchildren. I don't understand. It seems to me to be a fundamental contradiction. If Barbara and Karen Fields are right in racecraft, we ought to not be doing this.
Before we go to audience questions, let me just ask, just again, slightly related to this, what I call the model minority. You know, Thomas, you just said something very interesting. We shouldn't confuse people who come to this country with certain motivations with people who've lived here. But I also, I guess, want to explore that a little bit, because there is this sort of this myth of the model minority, but there's not a myth of model behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. And so can we teach the model behaviors in a way that is not paternalistic, that's actually just trying to share evidence that these are the series of things. There's nothing in life that's guaranteed, but these are the things that people who are quote unquote in oppressed categories do in their life. Like, why is that so third rail, it seems, to talk about what those behaviors should be?
Well, we can talk about those behaviors, and we know what those behaviors are. You know as well as anybody what those behaviors are, but we've entered into a kind of discourse now that's been mystified by race and the kind of all-encompassing talk of white supremacy, wherein qualities that are part of the model behaviors that lead to success, such as punctuality, objectivity, respect for the written word, even this whole conception that merit is something that exists. This has been called racist. This has actually been called racist. At the Smithsonian Museum of African American History, they, for a short-lived amount of time, had these bullet points up on the website saying this is white supremacy culture. I'm sorry, but it doesn't matter how well-meaning your anti-racism is as a white liberal. If you tell poor Black families and impressionable young children that literacy is white supremacist and that they have a different culture that values different things, and you would never in your life dream of telling your own kids that, because your kids are still going to go to Stanford and they're going to feel bad about it, but they're going to still do the work to earn their place at Stanford. But you'll tell Black and Latino kids that doing that crap is white supremacy culture. I mean, then we're a long way away from having a serious conversation, and we're going to have that conversation among ourselves, and we're not going to be able to rely on the mainstream discourse for that.
Yeah, you won't be hearing that in the schools that I run. Let's take a pivot, unless Glenn, you had a response, but I want to take a pivot.
I did not.
Answering questions from the audience. And one is, why are the three of you speaking about race to the Black alumni of HBS and writing about race in your articles and books if your goal is for Black people to stop thinking about race? It's a good question. I mean, my own answer is that the book I'm writing, Agency, is not actually exclusively for Black kids. It's for young people of all races, Because the truth is, in my own work, I see a lot of pain and suffering across the board. This idea of lack of agency, the issues that white kids face in Appalachia versus Black kids in the Bronx. I mean, there are differences, but there's a lot more similarities. And I think there are a lot of young people who are not aware of the behaviors that are likely going to give them the best shot in life. And I think the more that we seek to create what I call a multiracial coalition of people who are understanding the principles of family, faith, hard work, entrepreneurship, education. These are the kinds of things that are accessible to everyone. That's why I'm writing my book. So it's interesting. I'm curious what you guys think. It's a good question. We're talking about trying to ignore race, and yet we're talking to Black people. So what is it that's compelling us to even have this conversation?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think it's an unfair question because it doesn't make you wrong to say that race is a problem and we need to be thinking beyond it. It doesn't make you wrong to say that in the voice of a person who is within the racial system. In other words, we're in the system, but it's a question of trying to see beyond it. And I can't be disqualified from thinking outside the box because I'm in the box. I mean, that's why I say it's, in a way, it's an unfair question. But on the other hand, there's I think a deep and very legitimate point here, which I tried to call attention to previously when I said we were, in fact, speaking to the Black alumni of the Harvard Law School. And we
cool.
were trying to mobilize.
Don't insult us by saying law school.
I'm sorry. I beg your pardon. Please forgive me. The Harvard Business School. I know the difference. I really do. I used to teach over there. But I mean, you know, how can we act as a community without, you know, what are you going to do? Disband all the HBCUs? Tell the African Methodist Episcopal Church that it needs to change its liturgy? I mean, you know, we have the historical inheritance that we have. I came up on the south side of Chicago. I could be working on different things. I'm working on race undoubtedly because I came up on the south side of Chicago. But again, that doesn't mean that it's wrong to think beyond that. And that's all we're trying to do. We're trying not to be a prisoner of, we're not free from our past, but we don't need to be defined by it.
Yeah, I just want to build on that point. You know, this was a response that certain anti-communist writers had. You know, race in this way, I think, functions in a way that communism had in the past. You get kind of doubly victimized. You have the first initial victimization that the racists did to you, and then you have the longer term, constant victimization of having to be caught in the web of all racism's problems and trying to imagine your way out into a world beyond these problems. And that requires that you actually think through the conditions that have been imposed on you. I'm exactly trying to think myself out of this box that I'm in, not of my own volition.
Wow. Let me ask another question. So this person asks, a common way for ethnic groups to create upward mobility for their members is by setting up distribution systems to supply shops that the group members frequent, right? But the Black population, according to this questioner, seems to be focused on leveraging their education as a way to earn their livings. Do you think this dynamic can be changed? And what can be done to instigate more Black people to open their own businesses? And again, we're talking to the Harvard Business School African American Alumni Association. But how do we instill this idea that there is, you know, when I was at HBS, you know, lifting as we climb was our motto for the African American class of 1993. You know, so this idea of reaching back in a real way was something profound for us. What do you guys think in terms of how do we instigate this kind of thinking in the Black community?
Oh, I don't know if I have anything constructive to say. I take the point that exploiting the interconnections within a community, if products, for example, hair care products or something, I don't mean to trivialize, but I mean products that you know the ethnic group is going to be have in demand, and you have an ability to exploit that as a business model, that's a very reasonable idea. Barriers to entrepreneurship. I mean, capital is the first thing I think of. People need money in order to be able to launch enterprises. You can think about education in terms of teaching people financial literacy and making them aware of the possibilities of independent, self-employment and things of this kind. Banking and community branches and things like that. I don't know a lot about what's going on the ground, but I can see that a person might have a program where they try to build up financial institutions in urban areas and whatnot that are controlled by African Americans and things of this kind. But I don't have a pat formula here.
Yep. So someone asks, I think trying to get very sort of, let's get real. What advice can you offer to Black professionals to take care of ourselves against the barrage of racist biases that they face day in and day out, so that we can stay focused on our own Black excellence? To nurture and develop our own Black excellence to make a difference for ourselves, family, and communities, it takes lots of energy not to be adversely impacted by these negative biases. And this writer says, often perpetuated by quote unquote well-intended white colleagues and friends. Like, isn't that real? Do you guys experience that in your own work, that you're, as much as we want to not talk about race and recognize we need to go beyond it, on a day-to-day basis, you're being reminded in some negative way? Is that your experience too, as this questioner is putting forth?
That's not really my experience, not because I don't notice biases or microaggressions around me, but I'm almost 40 years old, and it's been a while since I've been sensitive to those things. I think that we do keep coming back to a kind of way of speaking that I don't mean to sound insensitive or glib at all by engaging in, but it seems to me that there does have to be kind of a degree of thick skin and resilience to certain things. If you're a graduate of Harvard Business School and working in some of these professions, I mean, you're doing better than just about everybody in the country. And I just think we have to be as a culture tougher about these things. I really do believe that. I've certainly dealt with actual racism and microaggressions, but those things have the kind of control and power over you that you allow them to have too.
Interesting. I mean, in the workplace, there are a lot of companies that are trying to make steps. I think it was just a week and a half ago, the Coca-Cola company announced that any legal firm that's going to work with them has to, I think, have at least 30% numerical goals. People of color. McKinsey has created numerical goals, gender equity, as well as racial numerical goals. I think McDonald's just the last couple of days. Is that the right approach? Is that the move to make, to try and address some of these? If companies are thinking, well, the way to address the barrage of racist biases is increase the leadership, for example, that are more people of color. Is that the strategy to solve the problem here?
I'm sure that there are many people like the person who put the question that you just read off, Ian, who feel the same way, they would be perhaps even insulted by having it called a microaggression, and they've steeled themselves to the necessity of having to fend off, this constant unrelenting. I don't want to say that it's not so. You asked Ian whether or not that was true for me personally. Not really, but I don't want to tell anybody else what they're experiencing or what's going on. I very much identify with Thomas's point about resilience. But I want to make a different point, which is that suppose you're in an organization And that's the way you feel about what's going on around you. Every little slight gets interpreted through that lens. The nature of your relationships with people within the organization is certainly going to be filtered through that lens. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy problem here. I say that with great respect. I don't mean to trivialize anybody's experience, and it may not even apply in the particular case at hand, but generically, that's not a formula for success. Is that what you were talking about here, Ian? That the chip on the shoulder is a very heavy weight.
That's very profound. Next question. This person says, first of all, thank you for holding this forum. Very informative and engaging. So nice to get some positive feedback during the process. But they ask, if there were one first action toward Black excellence you would like individuals or groups or people or governments to take, what would that be? Like what is it either in terms of policy or personal agency? And I think, frankly, what I would say to that, especially for the alumni, Black alumni of Harvard Business School, how'd you get here? In the face of all of this discrimination and racism, what were the steps? Demystify that. I think it's one of the great secrets for some reason. We need to preach what we have practiced in our own lives, even in the face of dealing with the microaggressions, all of those things. It doesn't mean that you're diminishing what those barriers are, but it seems incumbent, particularly for Black leadership, because oftentimes, again, there's white leaders who are talking about how pathologized and how oppressed Black people are, but where are the Black professionals to say, well, there's another side of the story, or the barriers exist, but they're not insurmountable. And here's the pathway. So that's the way I would, that's really the first thing that I would ask all Black leaders to do, is demystify their own story of how they've achieved their success. But Glenn, Thomas, what do you think?
I think that's so important. The Black professional class, the not the Black excellence that's the LeBron James Black excellence or the Jay-Z Black excellence, but the Black excellence that's a partner at a law firm, that is a Harvard Business School graduate, perhaps working in finance, perhaps creating a business that adds value in his community. These are invisible people in our culture. I mean that really. If you don't socially know these people, you do not really get a sense that these people exist. There's the pathological Black figure who takes up an enormous amount of space in the American imagination. And yeah, there's the extraordinary success in some form of entertainment or sports. But we need new narratives. I really think we need narratives of Black, educated, middle class, upper middle class life. We are severely lacking these things still, even in the year 2021. And that's something that I think we have to come together and kind of think about, how can we narrate these instantiations of success? Because they exist, they're all over the place, actually. If you do know socially people in these spheres, you realize that they're not nearly as rare as you would be led to believe in the kind of discourse of white supremacy that we have constantly coming at us every day. The thing about George Floyd, and what kind of bothers me when the conversation always gets made racial, George Floyd was not a Black man who was killed by police in Minneapolis. George Floyd was a poor Black man who was killed by police in Minneapolis, and that's a very different thing. And I think that we kind of, out of all types of different impulses, we conflate race and class and race. Blackness at the intersection of poverty dominates our psyche. And we need different stories.
Glenn, did you want to add to that?
No, that's good.
Yep. So related question. So this person says, many of us have learned, Black professionals have learned to survive and even thrive socially and economically in a racially biased society. But police brutality and killings is another level issue, right? What do we believe should be done to address police brutality as a part of reaching racial equity?
Well, it's a fair point. The evidence, as best I understand it, not just killings and shootings, but the general use of force of police against citizens, does show some inclination of police to use force more frequently when encountering African Americans. And we could talk about policing. I mean, you could talk about the recruitment of policing, about the training of them, about the nature of their accountability, the rules of their engagement with citizens, and so on. And I'm not an expert on, policing policy, but these are all things to be considered. I don't necessarily buy the premise of the question that this is a first order issue in terms of the affecting the quality of African-American life. I don't think you can talk about policing outside the context of talking about crime, and this will get to be very controversial. If you wanted to talk about the issues of violence, you have to talk about it across the board. While I affirm that Black Lives Matter, and I see no problem with protesting against police brutality, if we're going to get into a conversation about the integrity of the Black body, we have to talk about what is actually violating the integrity of the Black body as a matter of fact. And there's 25 or 30 times as many African Americans killed by crime, street violence, murder, than there are who are killed by police officers in the country. And I think that's probably a lowball estimate. So now we're into a different kind of conversation. So, I mean, we can talk about policing, but if you're asking me, Glenn Lowry, I think it's really not a first order issue. It's a first order newspaper issue. It's a first order narrative issue. But in terms of the objective quality of life of African Americans,
I mean, I've had this conversation many times over, and usually when I'm engaged with someone respectfully in this kind of conversation around racial equity, where they go with a response like that, they say, well, it's because of the conditions that have led to the increased crime. It's almost as if there's no point at which there's any kind of responsibility or accountability taken. They just say, well, it keeps going back and back and back, where the white supremacist structure created the conditions that then led to more increased crime, which then led to more fatal interactions with the police. Like, how do you, and this is a real question, because I think everyone wants to be able to have this dialogue on these issues in a respectful way. And like, the data doesn't match up to the narrative. That is the data in terms of, for example, police killings of unarmed Black men, the level that actually happens relative to larger numbers, and certainly relative to Black on Black crime. But when you try to have that conversation, it's extremely difficult, and because it doesn't fit the narrative. Any commentary on that?
Yeah, I think that the narrative and the reality are two separate things. I mean, I was in a clubhouse room this summer with MC Hammer in there, and MC Hammer said that, he's paralyzed with fear that his son is going to be killed by police. That's just not true. That's just not true.
He probably got a lot of accolades for saying it, though.
He did. And, it was one of those moments where there's nothing you can say, there's no data you can produce in that room, which was full of people that are richer than MC Hammer. There's nothing we can say to get some people to believe that that's not true. I have Black Lives Matter raised a very important issue. America is too violent, and police in America are appallingly violent by the standards of other developed nations. 1,000 Americans are killed each year by police. That's crazy. I think that 56 people have been killed in Wales since the 90s by police. It's a bigger country, but it's a lot bigger. The death rate is insane. With that said, there's 340 million people in America. There's 44 million Black people. 250 of the 1,000 people killed each year are Black. 500 are white. disproportionately blacks are killed by police, but a decent chunk of the deaths each year are white. You know, like we don't have a narrative that, or let me rephrase that. The best kind of way to address this issue would be to say that America has a policing problem and everybody should care about this, and white people should care about this too, because 500 white people are getting killed each year. This is an American problem.
Right.
And to racialize it, first it makes it seem as though white people don't have to care other than out of sympathy for this kind of black problem that exists. And it also, it distorts the issue in a way that makes, I think, black people think it's more definitive in their lives. And it doesn't talk about, again, George Floyd never would have had an interaction with police if he wasn't in a condition of poverty to begin with.
And he was also in the midst of committing a crime.
Well, it was a frivolous crime that you shouldn't be killed for, but why did he have a counterfeit banknote? Because he wouldn't have had that if his father were MC Hammer or if he had gone to Harvard. So I think that we can't separate these discussions from the fact that we're talking about the police kill poor people in America.
So who has the moral authority to say these things? Like Glenn, you said no one's coming to save us. And to some degree, that actually lets Black institutions off the hook, right? What about the Black church? Like, there's got to be someone that can say the things that we're saying in this conversation and be confident that they're not going to be canceled or eliminated from public dialogue. So what about the Black church or other institutions that should be able to say just the things that Thomas said to bring some factual information and make a moral plea for the kind of behavior that we know will lead to better outcomes for Black people?
I expect that there are many people who would say, maybe even in this audience, who would say, well, what do you think is actually happening in the Black church? If you actually go into a church and you listen to the sermons that are being given, you go to the men's fellowship of, and you hear what kinds of stories are being told as people share around the table. If you listen to the content of the prayers that are being prayed at, whatever it is, the Bible study, that this is the kind of thing that they are saying, and that it's just not polite to say such things in, as it were, mixed company, that, the conversation about responsibility within the church takes place in a register, in a language that is somehow insulated from the macro politics. I mean, I can imagine such a thing being said. I used to be more involved in church life, African Methodist Episcopal church in Boston than I am these days. But as I recall, there was a lot of talk about responsibility. It's the movement of that conversation from the church basement kind of private space into a more public space that I think is difficult to affect without seeming to betray the political interests of the group by giving aid and comfort to conservative critics and things of this. I mean, there's a lot here, Ian. So, for example, the cultural politics debate about transgender issues and gay rights and things like that, or whatever, are a part of the equity conversation too. And they can cut against some of the traditional value reflexes or orientations that we associate with the church, and there becomes a dissonance and a kind of generational and cultural tension that's in there. So I think as American society secularizes, the ability to carry on open public discourse explicitly in the idiom of the church becomes less and less. I can't imagine that a big public process of transformation, such as Martin Luther King was at the helm or the leadership of in the 1950s and 60s, in the idiom of explicit religiosity that he embodied, would even be possible today. Certainly Black Lives Matter shows no sign of going in that direction.
I mean, Black Lives Matter, according to the official organization, one of their tenets was committed to the destruction of the nuclear family. And it's hard for me to imagine any transformation of the Black community that's not first grounded in two institutions. And the first is family, and the second is the faith community. And again, again, I would love to get more questions from the audience on this, but it just seems like, you know, we have a person just asked the question, as a father of two Black boys, 12 and 13, I talked to them about having to work twice as hard as their majority classmates, given the nature of the world we live in. Similar to what you heard when you were growing up, Thomas. And the writer says that has the potential to be a heavy burden. Is there another approach or message that might be equally or more effective to inspire them to succeed in the face of challenges they face? You know, I actually don't think that that's such a bad message if you feel you got to wake up earlier and work harder. But what do you guys think? Are we putting too much of a stressor on our kids when we tell them things like that?
I mean, you should have heard what my father, for most of my life, he supported the family by, students would come to the house and study with my father, and he prepared them for the SAT, GRE, LSAT, all that stuff. You should hear what some of the Indian American parents were telling their kids they had to do. It wasn't work twice as hard. It was much more difficult than that. And, you know, what is the goal? What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to, this is an extraordinarily competitive meritocracy where you're dealing with people who, you know, there's something that I think has to do with the racial discourse that we're stuck in now that can't be separated from the fact that I think that competing with extremely ambitious immigrant groups and Asian Americans has taken a toll on white Americans to the extent that they would want to abolish ideas of merit altogether to preserve the status quo. And if using Blacks and Latinos as a way to do that is the way this is my honest belief. And I think if you're a Black or Latino first generation to be successful in your family and you're thinking of how to raise your kids, I think you have to be thinking more along the lines of who you're bound to be competing with if equality is the real desired goal.
Wow. I mean, guys, so in our society today, if you're white, you get a lot of points for, you know, putting the Black square on your Instagram page, or you know, canceling someone who's used the N-word, or somehow proving to the world that you are not the racist, right? Everyone else is, but you're not the racist. Or you've bought Robin DiAngelo's book, like you've paid your price, right? So if we think that that is just performative nonsense, then what actually is it that we want? What is it that the Black community, not that the three of us speak, you know, because we're not a community that any one person represents us, but what is it that you think white allies should be doing to advance the cause of Black prosperity and prosperity of all people?
I have no idea how to respond to that.
I mean, is the answer nothing?
No.
I mean, don't make me your project is my answer, but I don't want to speak for everybody else. I'm not your project. I'm not your pet. You know, I mean, I am not the path to the expiation of your guilt-ridden conscience. That's not who I am. So,
wow.
I am not your Negro. Isn't that how Raoul Peck put it in that James Baldwin film?
I think, you know, the way that they can go about being good allies is by investing in making a society in which we make it possible that people can have healthcare, that we make it possible that people can have access to childcare. These are things that I think really matter. It's the kind of patronizing interest in me as a member of an identity group, I don't think does as much for me as it does for the person that's posting the Black square on their Instagram. Even though I believe that a lot of people did that out of a genuine kind of feeling of having been moved by having witnessed a terrible injustice on video.
I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I think there's a genuine desire of a large population of the white community to do something. And I think that's the challenge. I think the some things that are being rewarded, these actions are, you know, they do not create more academic opportunity in the schools that I run. I mean, I just saw, was it Aunt Jemima just changed its name, the pancake syrup. Like, seriously? And there's someone who's patting themselves on the back because they now think they've advanced the cause of Black people.
Taking down the statue of Abraham Lincoln in Chicago won't get a single Black youth out of poverty. It's just not even, we're not even talking about the same thing, but that's the level of anti-racism that people are patting themselves on the back for. And I think it's tragic, actually. So I think that the way that people can help Black people is by helping American society.
Glenn, what were you going to say?
I was going to say taking down Abraham Lincoln's statue is wrongheaded on many levels.
Because San Francisco has just...
No, I understand they have done. I'm sorry, I thought it would be kind of self-evident why it's so.
We have to make the implicit explicit in our current era.
I just mean to say we can't solve this problem without the country. The problem of the exclusion and the underrepresentation and the disparity and the gap. We need the country. So the American project is a necessary predicate or precondition for the African American project. The United Nations is not the forum where we're going to litigate this. It's going to be American politics where we litigate this. So there's something just profoundly disproportionate about the iconoclasm of smashing the central symbols of a national narrative of a collective enterprise. I mean, Lincoln obviously was not a perfect person, and obviously in the year 2021 would have views that we might find to be inappropriate. But Lincoln presided over the emancipation of the slaves. This is deep level national iconic symbolism. And to it's petulance, it's sophomoric, it's adolescent tantrum throwing to smash those symbols. It's on behalf of no coherent politics whatsoever.
Mm. So as we come to the close, maybe one of the things we should do is highlight those things that are being done in the name of racial equity that actually could be helpful. So for example, Netflix recently decided to take 2% of their cash holdings, which in the case of Netflix turns out to be $100 million. And rather than give that to an organization like Black Lives Matter, they transferred that money to now be managed by Black-owned financial institutions, and which was a huge injection of capital to those institutions who exist for the purpose that, first of all, they typically exist in low-income communities. And there's a sense of reciprocity because people now coming to get access to that money have to present credit-worthy ideas. If they want a loan, start a business. So it's an example of a generative investment that actually seems like that is the kind of action. Like, so if you're in an organization and you're trying to help allies or you have control yourself, these kinds of ideas that literally ask for something in return seem to be very powerful, and those that are generative. Are there other examples of organizations or individuals that you're seeing where you say, you know what, that actually, if we had more of that, then maybe we would be making more progress as a people?
Well, let's mention Bob Woodson, 1776 Unites, and grassroots organizing around the country in low-income communities to empower poor people, giving voice to mothers who've lost children to gun violence, helping ex-offenders reintegrate into society, working in cooperation with police officers to try to improve community relations, working on the educational side and developing curriculum, which you were involved in, Ian. You know, I think that could be mentioned, although it's not on the same scale as $100 million. Is that what you said?
That's what I said.
And that's what I was talking about earlier when I was saying financial institutions, intermediaries that make funds available. I hope somebody is studying that and keeping track and tabs on what is happening with those funds so that we can make an assessment 10 years out, 5 years out about what the net impact of that is.
Thomas, I don't know if you have any examples.
Off the top of my head, I don't, but I'm at a slight disadvantage here. I've been living outside of the country for 10 years, so I don't.
Yeah. You know, the thing that I think that I would want to focus on is, as we all collectively think about how to move from persecution to increased prosperity, is to once again come back to first principles. You know, what are the institutions that have typically been grasped by any group of any race? And typically it's around family, faith, entrepreneurship, education. So these kinds of investments, how does it link to one of those institutions, what some people call mediating structures, that ultimately are the institutions that have the greatest influence over the outcomes of not only our people, but people of all races? And as we come to a close, and Sherry, I'll come to you in a couple minutes. Glenn, Thomas, thank you so much for just this open and honest conversation. I know we could go on a long time, but any closing thoughts you'd like to share in terms of, you know, again, we as a Black community, there are issues for sure. But what's the final message? What's the takeaway for what we collectively should be doing if we are genuinely concerned with the advancement of our people?
I just want to say I've just been reading through the questions on the side. They're fantastic, first of all, and I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to address nearly as many as are posted, but my answer to your question and my closing remark is just that we need to recreate a lot more of what already exists in this space. The attendees have a lot of the answers already. And I think we need to find ways for people and views and voices like this to be part of the narrative, and not just the kind of thing that we've been talking about all night that flattens complexity within groups and between groups. You know, I even saw that one of the commenters posted that when you talk to people personally about these things and they feel comfortable, they'll admit that the racial discourse is out of whack, but basically they don't want to be seen as siding that way publicly because it seems to give credence to right-wing kind of reactionary anti-Black stances. So there might be actually much more capacity for having sane conversations than exists. And that's what I'm really interested in, is finding ways to get outside of the limiting narrative and discourse that we're in now. And this gives me hope, to be honest. So my closing remark is just that I want to build on what already seems to be existing too.
Ian, you've heard this before, but I'm going to say it again. Urgency, agency, and honesty. Okay, that was the way I closed out that Manhattan Institute program that we were on a couple of years ago. But I truly believe it. I mean, first of all, fire alarm, first order issue here. Don't let the 21st century get too far along without us actually grasping the nettle and starting to confront some of the problems that are manifest in our community. It's not going to be easy. It's a generations long enterprise, but the development imperative, it's urgent. Agency, which is that nobody is coming to save us. I've said that before, but I do believe that very profoundly. The progressive impulse to want to respond to anti-racism appeals and all of that is okay as far as it goes, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. It won't raise our children and educate our children for us. Nobody is coming to save us. And honesty, I mean, the young men who are committing the violent crimes that are taking the lives of babies in the Black communities around this country are behaving despicably, contemptibly. I give that as an example. There's no excuse for it. Okay, we have to be honest. We have to stop telling the noble lie. We have to stop looking away.
Thank you, Glenn. I mean, this is profound. Thank you so much for everyone that was listening to this. I mean, my takeaway from the both of you, in some ways, we are the ones we've been waiting for. This is the Obama battle cry in 2008, but it's true. The secrets to success for the Black community already exist within the Black community. The folks that are listening on this call, your lives are evidence of it. And I know every single one of us has faced the very challenges, the very structural barriers we're all talking about, and yet we have found a way. And it's not just happenstance. There are strategies. Nothing's a guarantee, but there are strategies. And I find that inherently optimistic. It's why I run schools, because I want the next generation to know what is possible for them to achieve, what is within their grasp. These factors around faith, family, hard work, entrepreneurship, education, they are accessible to everyone, every single one of our Black children. And my hope is that we as Black leaders continue to impart that message, not to negate the factors of structural barriers, but to actually impart the tools that will allow you to have the agency to overcome those barriers. So thank you very much for this opportunity to chat. We look forward to having a series of these kinds of discussions, especially in our countries this moment as we reckon on race and how we move forward as a people. So thank you very much, Glenn, Thomas. I knew you'd be excellent, so thank you for exemplifying Black excellence. And with that, let me close and hand off the baton to Shari.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Ian, Glenn, and Thomas. I mean, for truly engaging and thought-provoking conversation. Quite frankly, some real talk around reframing the conversation from persecution to prosperity and excellence. So really, I learned a lot. And I also like to thank all of our attendees for taking the time to join us as well. I hope you enjoyed tonight's event as much as I did. Before we close, let me remind you of a couple of additional events taking place in February and March that we'll hope you'll also attend and join. The first is the alumni meeting on Saturday, February the 27th from 12:30 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time during the H. Naylor Fitzhugh Conference. And then the second is the Business of the NBA webinar on March 17th from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Both events are surely going to be very interesting as well. So we hope you're able to register for those. Again, thank you for everyone joining us this evening, taking your time. I hope that everyone stays safe and well. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you.